Kari, there you go. I've known Kari since before she was born, which was really odd, since I've never met her until about 3 years ago. A few weeks after having met Karen, sort of Kari a long way somewhere, she loaned me a book that her father had written, which is really, really odd. When you give a book back, having read it, you know more about the individual than they probably remember themselves.
Do you know the names of my childhood pets?
Yes, but I can't remember them anymore.
But I met you like twice.
Yeah,
you named
that's it.
And
I even know how not to fell a big tree. That's nothing to do with Kari. Now, Kari did her initial sort of undergraduate studies at the University of Oregon in German and Scandinavian, obviously finding something about languages that was fascinating along the way, because she did her PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, is that right? Yeah. Moving on from there to sort of various places, I'm sure, but amongst them, working in Barcelona.
You studied.
No, right, so working in Barcelona in a robotics project where there was obviously something language-based there too.
Yeah, they were trying to convince them to teach each other to talk.
Yeah, good. Yeah,
they did a little bit, but they're pretty stupid. Yeah.
Well, I've heard a few conversations along those lines myself, but yeah, not here, of course. Well, anyway, the language of arts. I'm sure you've got a lot more to say about it than I have.
Yeah, it's actually longer than I expected. I thought it was a 20-minute topic. Maybe it was a longer. So it's kind of long. So sorry.
I read that.
Everyone get a drink. Get a drink.
Sorry, thank you very much.
I did this while I was working on the robotics project, so this is my spare time. And it's a study that I did based on a series of collections. So it's a corpus study. That means I looked at a collection of texts, and these are the texts that I looked at. So I'll pass this around while I'm talking. And you can see that it's very varied and has a lot of representational artwork and a lot of abstract artwork, which is unusual. So how many regular publications have both abstract and representational works? Can you see? Am I in the way?
That's all right.
Okay.
That's a good place for you to be.
That's okay? Okay, I'll move on this side, but I have better access to my line anyway. Okay, so this is reviewed to you, but it wouldn't be to linguists. So you know that representational art is, as I'm defining it for the purpose of this study, includes identifiable imagery, at least identifiable to the one who painted it, if not to other people. Abstract art involves non-representational shapes and line and color and so on. So this is kind of a well-recognized division in the art world, I think. And so this is what I intended to study, was differences between these two philosophies that go along with these two types of artwork. So my field is conceptual metaphor. So I study metaphors and how these give you insight into cognitions. And because that's my field, I decided to study the differences between these two approaches to artwork from the perspective of metaphor, and the metaphors that these artists would use in their language. And that's why I've actually studied artist statements, so what the artists have written to describe their work as opposed to their artwork themselves. So artwork itself can have metaphors in it, obviously. So a saint, some holy person in artwork can be emitting light to show how holy he or she is. So that's a metaphor within the painting itself. So I'm not looking at that.
What's a metaphor?
A metaphor is a mechanism for conceptualizing the abstract in terms of the concrete. So it's abstract in a different sense from abstract art. So abstract thought is obviously more complicated than concrete reasoning. And so we reuse a lot of what we know about the world in concrete areas of cognition. We apply that to abstract reasoning. So, for example, we think about time and accomplishments and goals and life and romances and goals. We think about that, which is obviously complicated. People wonder what's the meaning of life and so on. So we think about that in terms of space and movement through space. So that's one of the ways that we conceptualize something very complex. in terms of something that we've been doing our whole lives. Is since we're born, we move our arms and we look around and we want things, and so that's something that we at least think that we understand really well and have a lot of structure related to. So we apply that to more abstract concepts such as reaching goals. So we talk about moving towards our goals and overcoming obstacles so that we can reach our goals, and all kinds of things like that. So we have all this language that reflects this metaphor that is theoretically is presumed to be, and there's some evidence that it is conceptual. So it's not just in the language, but we actually think about our goals and experiencing time in terms of space, which is more concrete. So that's just one example. There's a whole list of examples. So there's all these different correspondences we use between something more concrete and something more abstract, and that allow us to reason about something that's less easy to get your head around. So that's kind of, I'll be talking more about the specific metaphors that are involved in this study. So what I'm looking at in this study is the metaphors by which art is conceptualized as language. So artwork is inherently a complicated concept. Some people argue that it's something that we can never completely define, that it's inherent in the nature of the concept of art, so that it will be disputed as to what constitutes art. And what do we use to talk about art? Well, we use language. So language is presumably more concrete than art. And I think that's probably the case. But maybe I'm biased, being a linguist. So these are the topics I'm going to talk about. So I'll just begin with review for you, which is just talking about representational versus non-representational art. And then I'll focus on 3 different types of metaphoric language that instantiate this underlying metaphor by which we think about art as language. And so I'll be talking about well, what is the language? So if we speak using art, well, what is it that we're using to speak? What are our words? What are our vocabularies and our syntax and so on? And does this differ for representational and abstract artists? Then I'll talk about narrative. So raise your hand if you've heard about artistic narrative in a painting, or visual narrative. Most people, okay. So that doesn't require too much explaining then. But narrative is the same for representational and abstract artists. And then language is primarily for communication. So, and art potentially also involves communication. So who is it that these artists are talking to with their art? What is it, who are they communicating with? And is that the same for representational abstract artists? So, did I pass around that book? Okay, book's going around. Oh, that's okay. That book's going around. So this is one of... That's okay. It's a long talk, so take your time, but... that's okay. But anyway, this is one of 4 books that I used in this study. It's a collection of 160 artist statements total from this volume and 3 other sequential volumes. They're just too heavy, so I didn't bring them all. I just brought one because it's representative. So each one includes 3 paintings and then a 1-page artist statement from every artist. And I mostly use the artist statements rather than the artwork. But you can look at the artwork if you like.
So does the statement refer to the whole 3?
Yeah. It's a statement of their philosophy as an artist and what they're trying to do in their work.
And are the 3 paintings related or totally?
It varies. They're usually related. So usually artists that would be included would have some theme to their work. So the beginning artists, so they're all very, very junior, they're relatively new, but they're well established enough they have some kind of theme to their work, and so that's what they're supposed to describe in their artist statements. So of these 160 artists, each having 3 paintings and 1 statement, I sorted the artists into 3 categories. So representational, non-representational, which I'll just use interchangeably with abstract, and then partly representational. And because I found it, initially I wanted to judge whether artists were representational on the basis of their work, because that seems obvious. But then looking at the statements, I found that a lot of artists describe themselves as representational when I couldn't see any representation in their work at all. So I decided that the artists were the experts, they knew what they were trying to do, even if I couldn't tell what it was they painted. If they said they were representational, I would take them at their word. So I judged their work on the basis of the terminology they used to describe it themselves. So if they used words like figurative, representational, then I thought, well, they think their work is representational. If they used words such as abstract, or without recognizable form, or not having a reference, then I thought, well, it sounds like they consider their work to be non-representational. And then the partly representational artists, they combine aspects of both of these. So they would say that their work is abstract, but they're also interested in figuration, or they combine images and spaces, or images and color, and so on. This is a pretty obvious example. So there's one section that's kind of clearly abstract. This which I guess is foliage trees, and then one section that's pretty clearly representational. And all of his paintings are just like that, pretty much. So I think that one might be right for you. And then this is another way in which artists could be partly representational, in which their work might be considered completely representational, yet they're clearly interested in the abstract forms within it. So this could be considered almost photorealistic. It doesn't come across very well in the slide, but it's basically photorealistic zoom in on a skyscraper. So these are windows, and once you know what it is, it looks extremely real. So and he says it blurs the line between abstraction and representation. So I thought, well, that's another way in which it can be partly representational. So based on these criteria, just within the artist statements, without actually looking at the paintings at all, I sorted the artist into representational, non-representational, and partly representational. So the representational artists were more likely to include relevant examples of this metaphor. And I guess I don't talk about that. But the reason for that is because many of the non-representational artists have just kind of bizarre and irrelevant statements. Like, I never had enough coins for the gumball machine, and that's the whole statement. It doesn't talk about their work at all. And one was blank. So that, I think, is why there were fewer non-representational artists that had relevant metaphors, because they were very short. So they'd have a haiku or something, and that would be their whole statement. And none of the representational artists did that. They usually talked about their method and their intent. And so there were more metaphors in their statements. Okay, so this is the formalism that's kind of unfortunately included in this talk. So this is let me see if I have here it goes, so that's good. Okay, this is a system for representing metaphor. So remember I said that it is a system for, it's a system of conceptual structures that we use to think about the more abstract in terms of the more concrete, and to simplify a little bit. So in this case, this would be the more concrete domain. I mentioned that language is more concrete than art. I think it's more of a human universal than art, but you can argue with me about that. And then it's used this is another type of domain. So this is when the viewer sees the artwork. So this is at a different time than the artist's creation of the artwork, and that's why these are in separate spaces. So they're thought of all at once. So in order for an artist to talk to a viewer, we have to compress these different scenarios. So there's the artist painting, as the artist is creating the artwork, there's the viewer experiencing the artwork, and then sometimes we often think of the artist as speaking to the viewer, as communicating with the viewer. But it's really not actually that simple. This is a conceptual structure that we're using to simplify this and conceptualize this complicated process of creating an artwork and then later having it experienced by viewers in terms of a very basic and simple one, which is one human being speaking face to face with another human being. So it's called a blend because we're blending these different spaces and creating this complex space in which the artist can talk to a viewer, which may never happen. You may create, the artist may be long dead. You may experience a painting, be very moved by it, and feel that Picasso is speaking to you when actually he's long dead, you never met him. So this is a structure that we use to understand how we can be affected by an artist even when there's no direct contact between the artist and the viewer. So okay, so this is something that we use. This probably sounds somewhat familiar to you, that you think of artwork as speaking to you, or maybe even of an artist as speaking to you through their work. But what is it that they're speaking? So what language are they speaking? So Picasso spoke Catalan, you might not have understood him, but you see his paintings and somehow they speak to you. So it's not language, but something else is being metaphorically understood as the language. And it's one that speakers of different actual languages might have in common. So what I found is that in the statements of the representational artists, they tended to talk about their languages as being composed of systems of subject matter. So their languages consisted of the images and subjects that they represented. For example, this artist, she talked about a language of bridges, buildings, and skyscrapers. A different one, I think the partly representational ones that I showed that image from before, talked about the visual language. Oh,
I'm alright, I've got shoes on.
No, but don't touch it. Let's just sweep it up when I'm done.
Okay.
Let's just.
My apologies.
Yeah, but don't touch it. So he talked about architecture as being a visual language, and then other artists, representational artists, talked about having a vocabulary of symbols and images that they would reuse. So these artists often reuse subject matter, and they talked about that as their vocabulary, the subject matter that they like to paint. The abstract artists never used language like that. They never talked about having a language of images or of even symbols or landscapes. Instead, they talked about having a language of colors or forms, and sometimes of brushstrokes. So this was their repertoire. It wasn't of subject matter, but it was of brushstrokes or colors. This is one artist that used a number of these metaphors. I think she's relatively well known now. Makes a lot of money, so this is what she does. And she talked about the language of color. Other artists talked about the language of form. Some mentioned a language of mark making or brushstrokes. So this was the system that they conceptualized and described as a language with which they would communicate. So it's a different system, and it's like they're speaking a different. They consider themselves to be speaking a different language than representational artists. So, actually, any questions? This is supposed to be pretty informal, so yeah.
Yeah, no questions, but there is a Queensland artist who I don't agree with. Who I said if anyone started to talk about abstract and non-abstract art, you say all art is abstract. I'm talking about Amos here. And I agree with her entirely that, and I'm an extremely representational artist, but if I'm any good at all, and I'm probably not, the strength of my work lies in the basis of abstraction.
I think so too.
So making the distinction between abstract and non-abstract is what I'm always a bit suspicious of.
Yeah.
Representational is one thing, and of course representational can be very good.
Yeah, I think so too, and that's why, and so if you like, this is actually why I'm using the term non-representational instead of abstract, exactly for that reason. And that's also why one reason I'm kind of skeptical of the need for so much abstract art, when most of what it accomplishes, I feel, can be accomplished with abstraction and representation. But that's kind of a separate topic.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, you can just. I'm just using abstract because when we talk about abstract art. So I think if artwork has representations, we don't call it abstract art usually. We may say that it involves abstraction, but usually if we talk about abstract art, we mean not having representation, or at least that I do. I'm sure people use it.
I think I understand that way, but I think we simplify.
Yeah, well, I agree. Yeah. So you can just, if I say abstract, you can mentally translate it to non-representational, because that's really what I mean. This is really about the presence or the absence of representation is really what I'm interested in. But so you might expect, actually, given that observation, that representational artists might also talk about languages of color, languages of form, but none did in this corpus of 160. So yeah, not one. Not one representational artist used metaphors like this, talking about a language of color or a language of form. So,
what about emotion? Didn't they? I'm a viewer. I'm not an artist.
they didn't. They didn't. No, none of them.
Yeah, as a viewer, that's what I judge art. What emotion it is.
Well, I think artists often are kind of speaking a different metaphoric language than viewers, and none of them talked about anything like that. One might have mentioned a language of expressions, a portrait artist, but not emotion. No, they didn't. So I guess I'll move on then and say, well, what is it that they're using this language for? So they have these languages, whatever they're comprised of, whether they involve color or form or subject matter, they have these languages at their command, and what do they use them to talk about? What is it that what is the subject matter of their artwork? And a lot of artists talked about narrative. It was extremely common in the corpus. I don't think I have the actual count here, but it is in the paper. So they talked a lot about speech, about stories, about narrative, and I think 2 or 3 talked about allegory. So for the representational and the partly representational artists, narrative was fairly simple. Narrative was the sequence of events implied by the subject matter. So I think the image of a very upset woman, there's an artist that does paintings of very upset people. I think he talks about narrative, and then the one that has, the one with just the drawings, there's like one with a boy with a gun. Let me see if I have it. This one talks about narrative. So these representational images, they talk about the stories of the subject matter, so the people, often people. But there we go. Okay, yeah. But that's okay. But you can look at it. You can see this. I think they say stories, or that's what the post-it notes are for, is to mark where there's metaphoric language that's relevant. So these, apparently 16 of the representational artists use narrative to talk about sequences of events, which is actually quite a lot. If there's only 160, that's 1 in 10 talked about narrative, so it's used pretty frequently, and that's not including abstract artists, or stories, or still life. were often talked about as involving narrative, which surprised me a little bit, not being so into still lifes myself, but apparently they involve narrative as well. Objects, narratives, yeah, still lifes, objects, but then especially the portraits and images of people involved stories and narrative. So with the imagery as the subject matter as the protagonist, so this boy is the protagonist of the narrative. So not the artist, it's the depicted humans. So the abstract artists actually had a very different type of narrative. They were talking about something completely different, and it was their own experience in producing the painting. So that was narrative for abstract artists, was their story of having created this artwork. So it wasn't anything about the subject matter or the figure depicted. It was about, it was kind of egocentric. It was about their own purpose of creating this painting, which none of the representational artists did. So here's one. He's done what, like 15 brush strokes or something. And yeah, and the rest of the canvas is empty. I think he was one of the ones I had the most trouble. I had to get copyright permission from all these artists to write about them in my paper, and I think this guy was one of the most obnoxious. I will also say the abstract artists were more annoying to deal with than the representational artists, and I didn't even know what I was writing about. They're just generally more rude.
Perhaps they're
more
most interested in your life.
Well, I mean, if you could, yeah, I wouldn't say no. Yeah, I wouldn't disagree.
At least they had to say no.
Yeah, less is more. Less is more. That must be it. This is definitely less. And again, it was the abstract artists that had the artist statements with the minimalist artist statements with statements just like, well, just blank or just a one-line text or something. And they had a whole page. They leave most of it blank. So yeah, they mostly talked about 6 of them mentioned narrative. So yeah, that's a lot of the artists that in total that mention narrative. Leaving enough room for a narrative of the creative process. So that's a pretty clear example. It's the story of how they created the painting, which you can actually really see. These brush strokes. I mean, I'm not impressed by this work, but you can see how it involves a narrative. You can see exactly how each brush stroke was created. He's used very thick paint. And you can see from which direction he painted each little dot thing. So yeah, it's pretty clear how it was done. And for him, that's worth telling this story. And then some of the non-representational artists apparently agreed with the representational artist's idea of narrative as involving the depicted subject matter. And so they would say that they weren't interested in narrative. So if they had that definition of narrative, then they would say, well, this isn't of interest to me. And this artist said that her work was not narrative, and so did some of the others. So if they didn't use this meaning of narrative, then they just said, well, I'm not interested in narrative, it's not what I do.
So that second one, why did she do it? Like, what is that shape up?
I don't know. I don't know. I have no idea. Not much to me.
No.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but it's not telling a story. There's no temporal sequence to it.